It's an honor to talk to everybody today. One of the things that was interesting for me going to the Parliament for World Religions is, first of all, I don't consider myself very religious. And when they sent us the packets as participants for the upcoming ceremonies and all the lectures, I grabbed the book and sat down and I scanned through the 800 lectures, and I think there was 3 lectures that had to do with science and religion, and the rest were ethical issues and issues that had to do with if you were a Hindu or if you were a Sikh or if you were a Muslim or a Catholic or anti-Semitism. It was all covered in there, but there was very little information or lectures about science and religion. So I had to back up and think a little bit about how I was going to address religion through scientific fashion to scholars that are academic and yet are very religious. So, like Michal said, when we arrived in South Africa, there was a very strong undercurrent about Americans showing up and telling everybody how to live their lives and what to do. And so I gave it some thought after listening to some of the lectures that were going on. We attended some of the lectures, and everything from psychotherapists talking about their view on religion and how to cultivate a meaningful life. And I sat in on some interpretations from the Hindu scriptures, and I listened to different swamis that were from the East talk about their belief, and there were old yogis there that taught Kriya Yoga that I met and talked to. And so I wanted to meet as many people as possible and just get a flavor for how the lectures were going. And I decided that after listening to everybody's point of view about religion, and there's a sense that what everybody's teaching they're convicted to, that their religion is some source of a solution for everybody. And after being in the school, as long as we've been in the school, there's a sense that this is like a sandbox. This is an arena that we get to play in, the practice being God. That we can actually take information that we're taught, and then we have the privilege to go out and actually enact that into truth. And one of the things that I noticed that was missing was that it was very heady. It was very intellectual and very academic, and I didn't really see a whole lot of people actually taking their scriptures, interpreting them, and then enacting them in their life, because they were plagued with problems that had to do with humanity. And that was one of the things I noticed right away. So I decided to gear my lecture or my talk towards, first of all, if I can appeal to anybody scientifically and give them enough information that we all have a potential. It almost takes us out of the context of religion. That if I talked about every human being having a potential, I talked about the potentials of the brain, then I would kind of sneak people out of their religious beliefs for a second to actually have them open up that there's actually more to them, whether that falls into the category of religion or not. It just gave them a little bit of freedom. That they had a little freedom and permission to look at themselves in terms of their own personal expansion. So the first half of the lecture I geared towards just covering some fun concepts about the brain that actually allowed them to start thinking about the what-ifs and the possibilities about themselves. And secondly, I decided actually in the last day that I was going to address the emotional body. And the reason that I decided to address the emotional body in the lecture was because whether you're religious or not, you have emotions, and you confront those emotions either way. And if I could find some commonality with everybody in the room and laugh at what it is to be human, and then sneak in the back door and said, if we eliminate those qualities of human emotions that keep us limited and actually prove to them scientifically that we're addicted to them, then it would open up a domain for them to be interested in what our school is about. So that was my strategy in attacking the test. I figured since I've been trained by such a great strategist in the last 14 years, why not use what I've learned? Now I'm ready to get started. Is everybody ready? So anyway, they asked me to do the lecture today as if I was teaching the way I was teaching in Cape Town. And because if I say I said this when I said this, I may do that a couple times, but I'll just try to give you the flavor of how I did the lecture that day. And a lot of it is about, if you've ever heard any of my lectures, a lot of it is about that same exact stuff. And it's about being human, so we'll get to laugh at ourselves at that, okay? So I started off by talking about, like I said, no one knew Ramtha. They kept saying the Rama what? You know, they couldn't get it. So I decided that I would talk about J.Z. Knight, and she channels a 35,000-year-old entity in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. School is designed actually to impart philosophy and knowledge to our students and then give them the permission to go out and take that knowledge and philosophy and turn it into wisdom and truth and ultimately have virtue. And the school is over 3,000 students strong, and that the miraculous is beginning to happen in our school, and that's something to draw attention to humanity. And I said the school was built on 4 principles. The first principle, of course, is that God lives within us, that it doesn't just live in a certain race of people or a certain culture or a certain religion, but it lives in all people, and that is the foundation of our school, that there is a dynamic quality within each of us that is unlimited and is within us and it's nowhere else. And that the second principle of the school is that everything that we think, that our thoughts actually create reality, that consciousness and energy create reality, not just some thoughts, but all of our thoughts create reality, and that the students acquire knowledge and information so that they could have a more expanded reality. That if we have a small knowledge base, then we have a small reality. And if we have a larger knowledge base, then we get a chance to experience a larger reality. So the student becomes a scientist in the reality by seeing what thoughts produce a certain result. And the third premise is that is to make known the unknown. Now, what does that mean to the average person out there? To make known the unknown means that we're building bigger models of thought based on this knowledge, so that those models of thought can give us a greater life experience. And if that our thinking produces reality, if we have a greater level of thinking and we could actually give ourselves permission to analyze and to scrutinize and examine the what-ifs and the possibilities inside our brain, then we would all of a sudden start having alterations in our reality. So making known the unknown is what the students in the school are about. And the last principle is that the school is designed to produce masters. Now, you don't really say that out there in the world, but we said it. We said that the school is actually interested in producing masters, that we're interested in having God-man, God-woman realized, and that's the intent of the school. And I said that the way that we know that that'll happen is that you have moments where you lose track of time. You have moments where you lose track of your body. You experience no body, no time. And that you're actually on a progression, learning from your past experiences to build a bigger model so that you can go a little further. And that there's never any end to that. We can just keep going in eternity because we take our knowledge base and we just build a bigger model based on the last model. And I said that no one in the school is actually graduated yet, but what's happening is that we're forced in the school now to start having to explain to the public how the extraordinary is becoming ordinary in our school. So I said, well, how do we explain spontaneous remissions? Or healing, or if one person regenerated a limb, why can't everybody do that? If one person can do it, then what is the difference? And so how do we scientifically explain the unexplainable that's starting to happen in our school here? And I said that the answer lies in the human brain. So there were facts about the human brain that I talked about that I thought would be really interesting. And the first fact was that in the last year, science has acknowledged that we actually use less than 10% of our brain. Now, we've all heard that from Ramtha, but now that's scientific documentation. And we invited a lot of physicians and doctors to come to the lecture, so I had to be really on top of it with asking the right questions in a scientific way. And I said, so in evolution, the universal law in evolution is if you don't use it, you lose it, right? That nature never wastes anything. And I said, if we use less than 10% of our brain, then in evolution, if we really look at our brain, the brain has actually only been getting larger in evolution and has never gotten any smaller. So if that's the case, why hasn't the brain changed in size? So that was the first question that I asked him. The second thing I talked to him about is that if the brain is made up of neurons, and the brain is made up of basically 100 billion neurons, and they look like a big tree. It's three-dimensionally. It looks like a big oak tree. And those neurons connect to other neurons. Well, the possible number of connections of nerve cells in the brain is greater than the number of atoms there are in the universe. Now, there's 10 trillion atoms that fit on the tip of a pin. So I asked them to look down at their paper and tell me how many atoms made up their paper or their notebook. And then I asked them to tell me how many atoms made up the room, and then the whole university that we were at. And then I said, well, how about every building on the whole, that's anything constructed in mass on the planet? And I said, remember, there's 10 billion on 10 trillion on the tip of a pin. And I said, how about that mountain? You know, they have Table Mountain out in Cape Town, this beautiful mountain. It's flat. I said, how many atoms make up Table Mountain? How about all the mountains of the world? And I just kept stretching them. How about this glass of water that I had up there? How about all the water on the planet? How about the air? How about all the molecules in the atmosphere? And if you add those all up, the Earth is just a speck in the universe. So your brain has the potential to concept greater than all of the atoms that exist in the universe. Now, if we were just to count the connections on the outside of the cortex of the brain, just on the outside of the cortex, of the 10% that we use, it would take 32 million years to count that. Just counting the connections, that if we were to look under a microscope and we were to count every one, it would take 32 million years just to count the connections in the 10% that we do use. Now, the other fascinating thing about the brain is not a static mechanism. Although the older we get, the more those nerve cells tend to get rigid and hard. And that's what we call hard wiring. So as we start to use the pathways in the brain neurologically, they become more familiar, and it's an easier path to travel down than to travel down a bumpy road that hasn't been connected yet. But if you travel down that bumpy road more, it starts to smooth out. You understand? So a child's brain is very what we call neuroplastic, very elastic. It has the ability to unconnect neurologically and reconnect to other neurons. The older we get, those neurons lose the ability to be elastic. They become rigid and stiff. As a matter of fact, if we took a razor blade and we cut through an adult's neurological processes or neurons and a child, the child's neurons would just do this immediately. They just pick up and they would reconnect. That's neuroplasticity. But if you did that with an adult and you cut it, it would look like this. And that's all you would get. So that's why they say neurologically the brain doesn't regenerate tissue, because it can't. It's lost its ability. Now, the average speed that the brain picks up information and travels information across the brain is roughly 270 miles per hour. That's how fast it moves from one side of the brain to the other. They now know scientifically that the brain is aware. One part of the brain, called the corpus callosum, we know what that is, right? And if we were to look at the top view of the brain, if we looked at it from the top, we have these two halves, right? We have this, and we have this, and we have these neurons in between. It's a bridge. The Ram calls it a bridge, right? There's about 300 million neurons that make up the corpus callosum, and if they just check the amount of nerve impulses that that area of the brain is aware of, it's aware of 400 billion bits of information a second. 400 billion bits of information a second is coming right from the corpus callosum. Now, the cool thing about that is that what level of mind is that? Fourth level of mind, right? So we know that fourth level of mind is aware of at least 400 billion bits of information, right? Because this is our hookup. Now, remember Michal said earlier that the eye processes a trillion bits, right? Remember he said that? It's happening all around us, but we're only seeing what we see. Well, if we imagine this whole wall here, from one end to the other, made up of a picture that looks like dots like this, you know, we did like a Monet painting, and we made it across this whole wall here, and we had a scene of Mount Rainier over there, and then an airplane flying by, and mountains and trees over here, and a tornado whipping by over here, and kids playing in the distance, and it was a big picture that we could all see. And that picture had 400 billion dots that made it up. This would be where we are. That's our consciousness. In other words, the human brain is aware in that level of the brain of 400 billion bits of information, but we're only conscious of 2,000. Do you know what those 2,000 are? If your back hurts, if your shoes are tied too tight, if you're wearing a hat, if you're hungry, if you're bored, if you're tired, it's only aware of information that has to do with the physical body. So this is where we're living. Our mind is living in the sea of the 400 billion bits of information that's constantly bombarding our brain in a second, but we keep choosing the same input into our brain. So I started talking to the scientists in the room and the scholars in the room about, well, then how should we use our brain? I mean, what is the right way to use our brain, and is there a wrong way to use our brain? And I said that, you know, this part of the brain here, we know is where our conscious awareness exists. This is where our conscious identity is. And this is where our personality is developed. Every experience that we ever have in our life, consciously, is logged up in this part of the brain, and it shapes our habits and our behaviors. This is who we are from a personality standpoint. Now, how does that happen? Well, we gather knowledge and information, and every time we gather knowledge and information, one of these neurons connects to another neuron. Now, in the yellow brain, there's roughly 50,000 connections per neuron. So picture that big oak tree. It's touching another oak tree in 50,000 places, or there's 50,000 connections that go on in there. Okay? And every time we memorize a fact or we gather data, that makes a connection. So we develop and learn and shape this yellow brain from knowledge we obtain and from experiences that we have. Here's an example. I can stand up here and I can tell everybody how to ride a bicycle, right? And I can go through the whole process of riding a bicycle. And you can gather a lot of facts and information. You can pay attention. And every time you do that, you make a synaptic connection here. But then when I tell you to get on the bicycle and ride it, you have to use a whole other part of the brain to hook up to this part of the brain where you've gathered all the models to ride a bicycle. So that shapes our habits and our behaviors. And it lives in a little box here that we call social consciousness that we all know about. And for example, culture has a very strong part of that. If you're raised culturally a certain way and you eat certain foods and you have certain ethics and certain ideals and certain ways you live, that shapes your habits and behaviors. And it's based on your synaptic connections that you have. Now, the more connections that you have, the more ability for you to process data. For example, when they did an autopsy of Einstein's brain, Einstein had, instead of 50,000 connections in this part of his brain, he had 150,000 connections per neuron in his brain. And what Einstein really was is he was a visionary. He really had to learn science and mathematics to be able to explain what the visions that he had and understood. I mean, he was 12 years old, and he asked himself, at 12 years old, if I was riding my bicycle at the speed of light and I turned my headlight on, would it go on? And he spent 10 years of his life thinking about that question every day. And so then when the realization started coming, he had to go and learn mathematics to be able to explain what he understood. You understand? So this is our conscious awareness. This is what you're listening to me right now with. I talked about this part of the brain. And I said this part of the brain is where the mind of God exists. There's no conscious centers in this part of the brain. There's no awareness here. There's no conscious awareness here. This is subconscious. This is below conscious awareness. And I said the mind of God consists of the intelligence of the smallest microorganism to the most advanced life form. On this plane and on all other planes, in this universe, in all other universes, past, present, and future. And this is what got him. I said, you know, if you took a slice of this part of the brain, remember I said there's 50,000 connections? In this part of the brain, in one neuron, there's over 1 million connections. And there was a Hindu doctor that was sitting in the second row there, and he raised his eyebrows, so I knew I got him. Now, so how does this work? Well, remember I said we learn, we gather data from knowledge that we learn and memorize. See, every time we make a connection, that's a memory. And from things that we experience. For example, when you're young and you put your hand on the hot stove, you learn to associate heat with the stove, so you no longer do that anymore. Doesn't that shape a habit or a behavior? Or if you're an infant and you cry out for milk when you're hungry, you learn to associate, hey, if I cry out, I'm going to get fed. So you start crying out to be fed. So we start developing these two laws of the mind. And the first law of the mind is called the law of association. And the law of association is how the yellow brain works. We use or identify past experiences to really build a bigger model. We identify with our knowns. When you associate, you're drawing from your present knowledge base to be able to understand. Didn't I say that a neuron looks like a big tree? How many people image that? The moment you image that, you associated what? A neuron with a tree. And you went, oh, yeah, I know what that looks like. So the law of association says that if I say red, you say apple. Unless you're from Italy, you say wine. Or if you're from Australia, this is great because, you know, everybody's culturally different, you know, so they have different associations. In Australia, when we were in Australia, I say red, and you know what they said? We all just shrugged our shoulders and went, right, blue. So we learn by these associations, and those associations develop a groundwork to listen. It makes a groundwork to accept things as ordinary or common. You know, when you're a child, you're constantly, why do children constantly interact with their environment and pick things up and do all that stuff? Because their brain is learning at an alarming rate. And what they're doing is trying to sort out the laws so that it all becomes ordinary. And they scientifically know that between the age of 5 and 7, they've developed critical facilities. They say, no, there's no Santa Claus. I've never seen a sleigh fly in the air. You know, they start thinking, right? So they start developing those critical facilities, and of course it's accelerated by television and everything else because they're gathering more data at an alarming rate that's giving them information to associate with to keep us limited. Okay? So law of association says, I associate with my present knowledge base to be able to understand another concept or another idea. That's a great thing. That's a good thing that the yellow brain should do. The second law of the brain is called the law of repetition. And the law of repetition says, if I do something over and over again, what's going to happen? It's going to become common or ordinary or easy. Think about any skill or task that you've ever learned. At first you start to learn it and it's hard and you can't get it, but what do? You keep practicing it over and over again until it becomes common or easy or ordinary. Now, I use this example when I do my lectures to the beginning students, but here's a great example of law of association and law of repetition. When I was in college and I had roommates that always fell asleep when they studied. Well, I studied at my desk, and they laid on their bed and read the book. And within 15 minutes, I'd look over my shoulder, and they would be face planted into the book, drool all over the book, sound asleep. Now, what does the law of association and law of repetition say? Law of association says, I associate bed with, and I go to bed every, no, so that's gonna be an ordinary or an unconscious process, and you can guarantee that in 15 minutes, that associative pattern is going to put them to sleep. You understand? Or another example is, you know, I love this one. You have a new baby, and he's all great and exciting, and then, you know, you love them, and they get to be 1 year old, and now they start to walk, right? So what do you say every time they're walking around and they go to grab something? What do you say? No. And you do this for a year until what comes? The terrible twos. So now you tell them, oh, would you do that? And what do they say? No. Say, all they're doing is using the law of repetition again. You understand? So we learn by the law of association, the law of repetition, and they give rise to habits and behaviors. And that's a great thing. That's how we build models of thought. If I said, if you could see the nerves coming out of the spine, they look like spaghettis coming out of there. Can everybody see what that looks like? That's how we associate. If you ever watch Ramtha teach, he uses great laws of association constantly to keep your brain firing pictures so you can stay with some abstract concept that you can identify based on your knowns. That's how the brain is supposed to be used. And I use this example in the lectures that I do, and I use it in South Africa. I said, how many people here, they call it a manual down there. How many people, when they first learned how to drive a manual, I'm thinking about when we were driving in South Africa on the wrong side of the road, you know. You're consciously aware, and then all of a sudden you miss a turn and you got to turn. What's the first thing you do? You go like this to turn your blinker on, and what do you turn on? Your windshield wipers. That's the first sign. And we were doing really great. And as soon as we missed a turn, we go, make a turn. We go, poink. And we're like, oh, we lost it. We're back in that old association. So we had to break the habit, right? So when you first learn to drive a manual, you know, they say, you sit with a person, you know, it's your brother, your older sister, your father, and they say, you know, this is so easy. They say, all you have to do is, I want you to put your foot on the clutch. I want you to put it in the gear. I want you to take your foot off the clutch very slowly, and at the same time, I want you to give it a little gas. Hold on to the wheel. Don't look at me. Hold on to the wheel. And you start doing this, and then what's the first thing you do? So then you look at them, and what do? You smile, right? And now you're what? Self-aware, right? Now you're feeling this anticipatory anxiety. You're like, oh, I hope I don't do that again. You know. So then you start up and you start off and you get out of first gear, right? You go to shift in the second, whoom, stop, right? And after about 30 minutes of that, you say, I need a break, I'm done. So what happens? You walk away from that experience, and what do you start doing? You start reviewing it in your mind. You say, oh, wait a second, I can do this. If my older brother can do this, I can do this. So then you start what? Reviewing. I got a clutch. I'm going to step on the gas. I'm going to take it off. I'm going to shift. And you start thinking about this over and over and over again, right? Constantly, over and over again. You're almost possessed with figuring out how to do this because you want to learn how to do it. And then there comes this point where you start to realize that while you're doing it, if you start to think, what's going to happen? You're going to blow it. So you almost have to keep practicing this without thinking. When you're doing that without thinking, guess what part of the brain you're using? This guy takes over. Do you know that this is what's running your hands? Now, I'll prove that to you. How many people here can drive a manual right now? Now, how many people have driven down the highway or in a city, and you see a person on the cell phone, shaving, drinking a cup of coffee, shifting, turning, having a conversation with somebody? Well, who's driving the car? This part of the brain. You have made that uncommon process very common. You've made it ordinary. You've had to review it over in your mind. You've had to model it in your brain. You've had to picture yourself doing it. You've had to do it almost to the point where you're bored that many times. And there comes a moment where it clicks, right? And you've just what? Had a very linear process become very nonlinear. And the moment that that happens, this part of the brain is endorsing that neural net. It's giving it permission to happen. And when that happens, you can drive your stick shift, have a conversation, drink a cup of coffee, talk on the phone, steer with your knee, do all of that stuff, right? But if I asked you to do that when you're initially starting out, you didn't have enough neural connections up there. So I said to them, and I was appealing to the neurologists in the room, I said, so neurologically, if we can make those connections in our brain, and you had the science of manifesting something from nothing, out of nowhere, then would everybody agree with me that the moment that we practice that over and over again, that uncommon process would become very common? So could you have a conversation at the dinner table and just manifest a loaf of bread? You could absolutely do it. It would be no effort to do, just like to drive your car, because it would be hooked up neurologically to this part of the brain. And once it's hooked up here, it becomes very ordinary. So I said the school was designed to make unrealistic, abstract, unlimited things very normal, very common. And that once we know how to do it, it's not that we have to learn from that point on. We just know that we know. Do you know what I mean? It just happens automatically. So I said that the brain then, this part of the brain was designed to build models of thought to create reality based on information that we memorize and from experiences that we've had in our life. And as we practice them and we go over them over and over and over again, like the list, they start neurologically starting to become part what? Automatic. Do you understand? Now, the problem in humanity is that we associate ourselves, this person, with people, places, things, times, I just put time, and events. For the survival of the body. Well, let me change that. For the survival of the body from the senses. I don't think anybody understood that when I said it in South Africa the first time. But our brain is what plugs us in to this reality. Do you know that? The brain that we have through the senses allows us to experience this plane. So, we associate with people, places, things, times, and events via our memory, and the brain is always analyzing its environment through the senses. It's always looking around saying, what's going to be comfortable for me? What's going to bring me pleasure? I'm going to move towards. And anything that's going to be uncomfortable, I'm going to move away from. And the brain does that through the senses very, very quickly. It does it automatically. It's constantly looking around, and it does that based on its knowledge base of the past. It says, ooh, this is an experience that I've had in the past that's uncomfortable with that person. I don't want to do that again. I'm going to move away from it. So the survival of the body has everything to do with what feels good, I'll move towards, and what feels uncomfortable, I'll move away from. And the brain is assessing the environment that quickly to determine what's going to be a threat to the body, threat to the personality, threat to the image, and it's going to want to move away from that and move towards what's comfortable or non-threatening. Okay? Is everybody with me? And when we do that, that defines the limits or the boundaries of this box. And this is what I said to them. I said, so if one of the laws in evolution is to make known the unknown, to evolve, and you have a present knowledge base based on your experiences, and someone offers you the opportunity to experience an unknown, what's the first thing you're going to do? The unknown is going to be associated with a threat because it's going to represent something that's unknown, that's not stored in that knowledge base, and so it's going to be uncomfortable. You can't associate pleasure with it because you have no neurology for it. So that, in its sense, develops the limits of this box. And so if that's our box, then that box is the greatest our reality could ever be. And then I said, I said, you know, if this brain is designed to create models of thought to produce a greater reality, how is reality produced as a result of that? I mean, like, that's a great conceptual thing, but how does it actually mean something in the brain? And so I gave the example of analogical mind, but I gave it in a very limited human fashion. I said, how many people have driven down the road and they got on the highway and they just drove for 45 minutes and they were completely unaware of anything, the exits, the cars driving, they were somewhere else. And they all raised their hand, and I said, you know, what happened then? Where were you when you were experiencing what you were experiencing sitting in the car seat? Where were you? And the truth was, what happens is, that's a state of analogical mind. When that happens, the internal picture in your mind, what's going on in your mind, listen closely, is more real than what's going on out there. Did you hear that? What's happening in here is more real than what's going on out there. And all of a sudden you lose track of time. Now, being human, the majority of the time when we're doing that on the freeway, we're usually somewhere in here, right? We're analogically our past. But that's a great example of analogical mind, because you could drive 30 minutes and you didn't see anything. You weren't looking. You weren't using your senses now to evaluate your environment. What we're doing is we're experiencing something more real that's taking place in our brain. And that's when the survival centers disappear. We're no longer assessing the environment. And the moment, because they've proven this scientifically also, that the brain does not know. It doesn't know what's real. If you image something and you image it clearly, the brain thinks it's as real as what you're experiencing out here. They know that now. Okay? The moment that you're examining a concept or an idea, let's pick an abstract concept and it's outside the box. We'll use the just drive and the stick shift. And you're entertaining the possibilities and the what ifs, and you want to keep thinking about the knowns, and you keep pushing yourself outside. There comes a moment in the brain where you freeze it. And the moment that it freezes, it's passed to the quiet area here. It's called in science, because they don't know a lot what's happening there. It's pushed to the frontal lobe, and when it's in the frontal lobe, that's when you think what's happening is more real in here than what's happening out there. The moment that that happens, this part of the brain has its direct hookups to the frontal lobe, and it endorses whatever the model is that you've just built. And that's how we create reality. So then I had a couple eyebrows raised, and I said, okay, I'll give you an example. And I use this example on the world tour, but it's a great example. So you have on your list that you leave your body and you remember, right? So you do this for 3 months, nothing happens, but you're doing it every day. Law of association, law of repetition. You're doing it every day because you want the experience. And so one lazy Saturday afternoon, everybody's gone. You fall asleep on your couch. It's late in the afternoon. And all of a sudden you fall asleep, and the next thing that happens is you go like this. Whoosh. And you come up out of your body. And you get so excited, and you go like this. And your first thought is what? That's me. And if consciousness and energy create reality, what happens next? Wham! You go back in your body. So then you sit up on the couch, you're pacing, you're out of breath, what just happened? What just happened? Then you start reviewing this thing. How many times do you review it then? About 40 times in 2 minutes? And you do this whole thing. And then somewhere along the line, you realize, based on all the neurological connections you've had from being in the school, now wait a second, if consciousness and energy creates reality, and when I came out of my body and I associated me with that body, I'm going to wind up where? So what do you say? This is the key. You say, the next time that happens, now the moment you say that, what did you just do? You started building a model, did you not? The next time that happens, I am not looking that way. I'm going to go that way. So then you start, you go back, you get to your list, you're a little more excited, you do your list. But what happens? 2 months goes by because you're trying, right? Finally, after some wine ceremony, you're in your tent, and next thing you know, it's a long twilight. Whoom, you pop up out of your body, and you go. I'm going to go that way. So you pick a point in the room and you start moving towards the point. And as you move towards the point, your next thought is, I hope I don't go too far. I don't want to leave that too far behind. And then what happens? Wham! So now you wake up, your heart's your heart's racing, you're up, you're pacing around the house, and what are you doing now? Here we go again. You say what? Now, first thing you got to do is you got to draw on your knowledge base. You say, wait a second. If I'm consciousness at that point, and my thought about my body is going to bring me back to my body, and I'm worried about my body, I'm really not my body, right? So what am I worried about? Okay, so you start saying that to yourself over and over again. I'm not that. I'm this. I'm running this show. So you got to keep, what? Repeating it till you get the, I got it, right? So then you say, the next time that happens, I'm going right through the wall. Because now I know I'm consciousness. I'm vibrating at a faster rate. So then you start thinking about this. You're driving in your car. You're no longer thinking about PPTTE. You're thinking about, if this happens again, I am going to shoot through that wall, you know? And so weeks go by. Everybody leaves the house. You decide to take a little nap. Whoosh, you come out of the body. What do? You start going in that direction, go in that direction. You get up to the wall, right? And you realize, you remember that I'm vibrating at a faster rate than this. So you see the window and you say, I can go through the window. It's thinner. It's just a thought. And as you start going through the window, you go through the first pane of the glass, and your next thought is, what if I get stuck? So now your heart's racing again, and what do you say? I created me getting stuck by having the thought about it. It's almost like don't think of pink elephants, right? So then, you go through this whole process, you do the next times, and what are you doing all along? Are you building bigger models of thought? So now you're brave, you pop up out of your body, whoosh, you head in that direction, you say, I'm going to back up and I'm just going to blast through this wall. And you go flying through the window, you come out the other side, and it's not your backyard. There's a huge mansion, a big lake, there's people walking around, and you say, wait, wham, there you go again, back in your body. Now, is there ever any end to this? Because how many dimensions are there? That can go on and on and on. So we build models of thought to experience greater realities. And the Ram talked about this last night in a sneaky way. He said, as long as we keep reviewing and recreating based on what we've done, when we bless something, what did he say about that? We see what we've done in the past and we make another choice and the moment we do that, we're building a new model of thought. And if we can stay possessed and stay rallied and stay focused on it and examine the what-ifs and the possibilities, and it entices our mind and we're thinking about it over and over again, the moment that happens, there's a moment, just by the law of association, the law of repetition, it will become very common and very ordinary. It'll become a known. And the moment that happens, Mr. Happy jumps in here. And it happens every time. That's how we have an analogical experience. So at this point, I told him to turn to the neighbor and explain that. Which I want you to do. So, just by this process alone, and knowing what you know now, do you think you'd have more than 50,000 connections after a couple experiences like that? And would it be outside the box of the 2,000 that you're consciously aware of? I mean, realizing that you're unlimited, and these have been my thoughts lately, is almost like just shifting your awareness to another part of the 400 billion that are existing in 1 second. That's all we have to do is just jump outside of these associations to these things that we think are so real. So, that's been my thoughts, and the way that I understand analogical mind because of that is when I'm analogical about something, I forget about myself. That's the best way I can say it. That I'm so involved in something, I'm no longer thinking about me. that I'm thinking about whatever I'm thinking about, and that's really where I'm at. I'm there. So, I mean, that's a state of being. But when we forget about, see, we associate people, places, things, times, and events from our past experiences to identify, because this is where identity is, right? These things shape self, and that's the habit of the human being. We have social structures and social orders and people, places, things, times, and events that help shape us, either culturally or traditionally or ethically or politically, however you want to say it, that shape who we are in this identity. So we're associating self with these other things. And we do it through all the five senses. You know, you walk up to someone and you say, you know, you look just like my Uncle John. Well, what are you doing? You're associating them with the known. Or you drive down the road and the radio goes on, and all of a sudden you start associating that song with a time in your life. And you just listen to the whole song, and where were you? You're associating with all those people, places, things, times, and events. That's a slice of the brain. Do you understand? Or you smell something. You smell a cologne. You know, how many times have you been in the name field? And you bump into someone, you smell their cologne, and you go, "Hi, Fran." And you keep walking. What are you doing? You're associating that scent with a known. Or we were in Scotland, you know, this is a great story, I love this. When we were in Scotland, they had the name, you know, the name field behind the dorms, and you know, we did C&E, and then, you know, there was a break, and they had breakfast, and then we went out to the name field, and they did an hour and 15 minutes of field work. And then right at 12 o'clock, because it was at a university, what happened? It was lunch. Okay? But if you've ever been in Europe, they have bell towers everywhere, right? So at 12 o'clock, what happens? Bells go off everywhere. That isn't a Pavlovian experience. So we got a late start one day, and we had to go an hour and 15 minutes, so we had to go past 12 o'clock. So at 12 o'clock, what happened? The bells rang. So within the next 5 minutes, the whole name field changed, because they were associating that bell with what? Lunch. And it wasn't coming, so everybody was getting a little what? Survival-oriented. You understand? So, now this is, so I said to the scholars at the conference, I said, sounds really easy, doesn't it? I said, I can tell you from experience it's really not that easy. I said, because we're addicted to our emotions. And I spent the next half of the lecture talking about that. I said, you think that's easy to hold a concept or an ideal, but we are so addicted to our identity in terms of these things that we can't hold a thought for that long, because we have to keep rushing back to shape this identity. So we spend our whole life up here. We never access this. So God is separate from us when we live that way. So on the tip of a pin is about 30,000 neurons connected to each other. And so imagine the size of your brain and those 100 billion connections of all those 100 billions and billions of neurons. So remember, the Ram said last night that every slice of the brain that we have is associated with some seal. Well, it has to be, because we live in the first three seals, and every thought we have is going to produce an energy that's going to move out of one of those seals in our body. We can't have a thought without defining it in terms of one of those seals. So I said, everybody that's human is addicted to emotions. If we're living as human beings, that means we're addicted to emotions. And so I started talking about it, and I said, imagine me cornering a dog in the corner of the room. And I walked up to the dog and I went like this. And I scared the dog. Immediately, soon as the dog, through his senses, determines a threat from the environment, what does it do? It says, I'm going to stay and fight, or I'm going to run. And how quick does it make its decision? Like that. And the moment it interprets a threat, a stress, we'll call it, from its environment, something unpredictable, neurologically in the brain, the midbrain kicks on and the autonomic nervous system turns on. And the moment that that happens, the heart rate increases, respiration increases, blood is sent to the extremities, teeth stand out, hair stands up on end, the adrenal glands shoot out a ton of adrenaline for this dog to make its decision. And it's going to use the adrenaline either way, right? It's going to stay and fight, or it's going to run. And it's going to make the decision immediately. And that adrenaline is released in very minute amounts in the body, but it is very, very powerful. And it's very powerful in human beings. You know the story of women picking up cars and off their infants and stuff? That's how powerful that is. It gives the muscles tremendous fuel for action. Now, when I cornered the dog made its decision immediately. It didn't say, geez, I wonder if he has a background in martial arts. Hey, I know his brother. I can take him out to lunch. We can talk about this. It didn't say that, right? It made its decision immediately. Now, what's the dilemma with human beings? The dilemma is the fight or flight mechanism doesn't serve us because we can't fight because fighting isn't socially acceptable, right? And you can't run because running isn't solve the problem. So what do human beings do? They rationalize, right? They try to rationalize the solution. And every time we interpret a stress from our environment and the body produces those chemicals, and we all know, I know from experience what that's like, and the moment it produces those chemicals, the body gets a hit of energy. Do you know that adrenaline is so powerful that it gives it a hit of energy? It gives it some juice. So now the human being can't fight and it can't run, and the body's producing all this adrenaline, and that adrenaline moves into the muscles and the tissues. And what happens? What does everybody say when they're under a lot of stress? Oh, my body is so sore, stiff. Well, why does that happen? Because the fuel moves into the muscles and it's never used. So what are the muscles going to do automatically? They're going to tighten up because it's what muscles are supposed to do. Do you understand? You understand that? So, the human being interprets the stress from its environment and it gets a shot of adrenaline. Now, this is where the problem comes in. What is this part of the brain? What is the first law? Law of association. So now, we start associating that hit or that shot of adrenaline or that boost, that feeling of being alive, that stress, that association of stress with that hit of energy with our environment. So stress starts to feel what? Good. Now, how many people have been around someone who's doing 50 things at once and and the moment that they have a break, they go and create something else? Or someone who's so dramatic or so involved in so many emotional things that they're so involved in it that they just, if there was a break, they would create something right then. Well, why does that happen? Because they're feeding off the adrenal glands to produce that high for themselves. You get it? Now, there's also another chemical that's produced in the adrenals, and it's called corticoids or steroids. Now, do you know what steroids do? They take pain away. They're anti-inflammatories. So now you get a double whammy. You get the shot of adrenaline, and then you get this pain-relieving chemical moving into your body. How many people have been under a lot of stress, and then when it's all over, they're like, ah. That's the corticoids released into the body. It takes the pain away. So now the person is overutilizing the adrenals. They're actually addicted to the chemistry to get the hit in their life. They love their job if it's stressful. They love the relationship if it's traumatic. They don't love it. The body loves it because it's giving them the chemistry that they need in order to feel alive. Do you understand? Now they know 4 things scientifically about this. They know that if the person is under consistent amount of stress, 4 things happen because of the chemicals that are released. The first thing that happens is they have a compromise in their immune system. Right? You know that if you take too much cortisone, if you get too many injections of cortisone, your immune system does this. Okay? The second thing they know is they know that the digestion is compromised. Now, why is digestion compromised? Yeah, if you're under fight or flight nervous system all the time when you're eating food, is any of the blood supply getting to your internal organs for metabolism? All the blood's sent to your extremities to fight or flight. That's why when you're sitting down to eat, if you took a breath and relaxed, you would switch nervous systems off that fight or flight nervous system in order to metabolize your food. See, the problem in this culture really isn't about the availability of vitamins and nutrients. It's about the state of being in which you eat. If you're eating on the fight or flight nervous system, is that food being metabolized or absorbed at all? No, it's not. The third thing that happens is, so we have immune compromise, we have digestive disturbances, we have a change in cardiac heart rate or heart problems. Remember the Ram talked about that last night. When you're under stress, what happens to the heart? It picks up. And the last thing is that we have a breakdown in the physiology of joints, tissues, and muscles. Now, does that not sound like the chronic diseases of this culture? So we're living as if what's happening out there, and all of us, me included, living as if what's happening out there is more real than what's happening in here. And so we're at the effect of the environment. So we live our life this way, and this is the example I used. We live our life this way, and then all of a sudden, our body starts breaking down. You have a high-stress job, you're putting out all these chemicals, you're living a rough life, you're in lack, you're not making enough money, you got all these problems, but it's feeding the body chemically, and you become hooked on them, right? And I use this example in South Africa, but when we were in Japan, in Japan we had, I don't know how many people know anything about the Japanese language, but when we were everywhere else, there's kind of a literal translation from English to Italian or German or whatever. It was pretty Spanish. It was pretty clear across the board. But when you go to Japan, they have symbols, and it's not a literal translation. So we had translators that were students in Japan, and they were going to translate for us before the RAM came. And then when the RAM came, they hired 2 translators that were from the United Nations, and they were just sharpshooters. They could just go. And so as I did my lecture the first day, they had the 2 students in the front, and I had to talk and then stop, talk and then stop. And by the end of the 4 hours, they were exhausted. They just couldn't do it. And so I thanked them, and then the next day I was doing the talk on the emotional body, which is very scientific, and I started writing, Diane's right there, I started writing down terms and all the things I was going to say, and I turn around, and not Diane, but the other translator, I turn around, and she is just in tears. She's just said, I can't do this. I don't think I could do this. And I said, okay, well, why don't we just take a break from each other? I'm talking this afternoon. I said, I created my day. Something's got to happen here, right? Well, what happened was the translator from New York came in early. And they ran up to her and they said, will you translate for the lecture this afternoon before, you're supposed to? And she had just flown all the way from New York. And she said, yeah, I'll do it. And I said, man, that's great. So now I have a professional translator on just a kind of a complicated talk, an in-depth talk. So we started the lecture, and I don't know if you've ever seen anybody translate consistently. I guess we all know now that I'm looking back there. But in Japan, they have to, because it's such a diversified style, they're writing things down and they're talking out loud and they're using the hand and the other person's talking in their ear, and it's just incredible stress. I mean, and they just keep going. They go, 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 go. And so as I'm doing my lecture, I'm looking at the translator, and of course I acknowledged her for doing it. I really appreciate it. But about halfway through, I realized that I was getting mixed messages from her. Like she was enjoying it, but it was hard, and she was enjoying it. I didn't know if she wanted to do it or not do it. And so then when I started talking about being addicted to stress, I looked over at her, and she looked at me, and we just connected eyes, and in this moment, we just started laughing. Because in that moment, she realized that she couldn't not do it. Like if I came up to her and said, listen, I know you're here, and I know you just flew around halfway around the world, and, I was going to ask you to do this translation, but I'm not going to ask you now. We'll get someone else to do it. You know what she would have said? No, I'll do it. I don't care how tired I am, I'll do it. And as I started talking about becoming addicted to the stress, she started laughing because she started realizing that what she was doing, that she had to do it. She couldn't pass it up because she didn't get the hit. Now let's talk about that. And this is the last part that I talked about in the lecture there. And it was really appropriate because what happens after we're under stress for a long enough period of time where we start believing that's more real and the adrenals are doing all that stuff? We develop allergies, we develop colds, we develop heart problems. It's starting to sound like the American culture, right? So, you're a person, you've been living under stress for 6 years, all of a sudden you're getting to a point where you're doing well, but you're still under a lot of stress, and all of a sudden you start noticing your heart starts acting funny. And you start getting a little scared. So you go to the doctor, and the doctor checks you out. He says, right now everything's normal. But you know what I think you need? I think you need a good vacation. So now he or she is just giving you the green light. So you come home and you say, that's it. I'm taking a week off. My health is more important. You take care of the kids. Now you're telling this to your husband, by the way. You take care of your kids. I went to the doctor. He told me, or she told me, to take 5 days off. I'm heading up the coast. It's an 8-hour ride. I'm getting a cabin, and I'm spending time alone, away from everybody. I've had it with my boss. I've had it with my work environment. I've had it with everything. I'm just leaving. So now you pack up your bags. You jump in your car, and you start to drive. Now you're happy, right? Now as you're driving your car, you're playing music, and then that kind of gets old. And so then all of a sudden, about 3 or 4 hours goes by. And what starts to happen? Now remember, your body hasn't gotten a hit from the stress that you've lived in every day in your environment. So remember this part of the brain right here? The hippopotamus? The hippocampus? That's the file cabinet, right? So what do? Let's see, I haven't really had any frustration or anger in the last 3 hours. Let's just go into the file cabinet here, see what we can bring up. So all of a sudden, you do this automatically, You flash it on the screen in the frontal lobe. And now you go through the last week getting angry at your boss because he created your heart condition, and you think of all the experiences that created, and you think of the 32 ways you're going to tell him off when you get back. And you go through this over and over again, and what are you doing? All along, you're creating the chemistry. Now, is there anybody in the car with you? Are you in your work environment? In your mind, you're in your work environment. So what happens is that the body starts craving the chemicals. Now, is that any different when you give up cigarettes or chocolate cake and all of a sudden, what's the first thing that happens? You want more of that, right? So now you break away from the environment that causes the stimulation physiologically in your body. And now all of a sudden, you start flashing the pictures to your frontal lobes so that you could, the body's doing that. It's starting to crave those emotions. And I said to them in South Africa, by now they were loose, we were laughing a lot. And I said, here's a sign if you're addicted to your emotions. The next time you're angry or frustrated about something, just walk up to your friend who's frustrated or angry, or you're frustrated or angry, just say, I'm going to stop. I'm just going to stop. Now, what usually happens if someone says, listen, I know you're angry and frustrated, but why don't you just stop? What do they say? No, you don't understand. You see, this person at this place did this thing to me the last time, and I'm going to get even. So we see that's the hook. That's how we get out, because we're hooked to the association of our identity, right? The environment's more real. So now you drive down the road, 3 hours has gone by, you're halfway to your destination, and you've gone through every emotion you could think of, right? I call that the full meal deal. Once you have one, you have them all. You go from anger to hate to unworthiness, you go right down the line, right? Now you finally arrive at your cabin overlooking the ocean. And what's the first thing you do? You fall asleep. You're exhausted. But did you do anything? Yeah, you did a lot of things. But it all happened analogically up here. So you produce all those chemicals, and those chemicals cause the body to feel alive. And the sign that we're addicted as human beings to those chemicals is because if we go through a period for 3 or 4 hours outside the context of how we live in our environment, then the body's got to drum it up for us. It says, go ahead, have a piece of chocolate cake. It just starts saying, bring something up, because it's craving those chemicals that we have fed it every day. Now turn to your partner and explain that, and then we'll finish up. So how many people here are in Blue College? So then what is Blue College? What you're doing is you're fasting from your emotions. Your mind and your body is going wild because even seeing and being seen has its chemistry. Do you know what I mean? Even the routine of living as a human being has its chemistry. It all has a chemistry. Even going out to lunch has a chemistry. It all has a chemistry, and you're breaking the addiction that you have identified with emotionally. Does everybody understand that? So, the pictures are always manifested in the file cabinet in the hippocampus, because we know that by the law of repetition, if we keep doing something over and over and over and over again, nature is smart enough to say, you know what? If we're going to do that over and over again, let's download it into a computer chip and store it in the hippocampus. It's taking up way too much room. And so we have these shocking or traumatic experiences or habits that bring us pleasure, and we repeat them over and over again because that's the known that we can identify with. It feels good. Is everybody with me? So as long as we do that, then here's an example. How many people have had a shocking or traumatic experience and you review it thousands of times? I know that because when people come into my office after they've been in an accident, and I ask them about their pain, you know what they keep telling me about? When the car hit them on the side, they keep telling me the same thing because they're reviewing it over and over. And if we review it over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, it gets downloaded into long-term memory. That is when it's hardwired here. Did you hear that? The moment it's stored into long-term memory, that's when it's hardwired here. So you know when you spend 5 hours in the name field, and you're saying, I'm wealthy, I'm wealthy, I'm wealthy, I'm wealthy, I'm wealthy. Well, the law of repetition says that if you're doing with conviction, there'll come a point where you'll actually start to believe that. And the moment that that happens, you shape behavior and identity. Being wealthy becomes a habit. You understand? It just becomes an automatic, common way of being. It's a habit. So wealth becomes a habit. Do you understand? But the law of repetition says we have to do it over and over again. Actually be it. And we be it long enough and we start believing it, then it's hardwired here. That's a nice thing. But the problem as human beings is that we keep reviewing our past emotional experiences that keep them hardwired into long-term memory and ultimately shape habits and behaviors. So when we're producing those chemicals or producing that chemistry in our body, it is becoming a very, very natural human experience. It becomes what's natural. You think that's normal. We think that's normal, right? So an example of that is how many times have you been around a person, you know, you're walking and you see a friend of yours and you say, hey, how you doing? And they go, good. And you go, what's the matter? Nothing. Are you sure? Yeah. Now they're all along, you know, they've just casted their line, right? And you say, no, what's going on? And they go, and you say the wrong thing. This is the wrong thing. Do you need to talk about it? Then you sit down at the table with them, and they go through all their suffering associated with people, places, things, times, and events, and you're sitting there, and you were doing great. You're sitting there. You've just entered into their neural net. They've told you about all the problems and all their suffering. They get done. You are exhausted. And what do you think they say? I'm so glad you listened. I feel so much better. You know what that's called? That's called redemption. Because at redemption, that's when the corticoids or the cortisones are released into the body. They make you feel you've gone through the whole emotional gamut till finally the adrenals produce the cortisones. And now you've gotten it all out in what? It's just like eating, you know, it's like you're fasting from chocolate cake. It's like eating the whole cake. You go, I'll start tomorrow. You understand? So then suffering almost becomes something that's going to bring pleasure. It's going to bring some type of relief for the body. Even though it's not pleasurable for the mind, the body's getting fed the chemistry that it needs. So the way it works now is that when the file cabinet, when you draw the information from the file cabinet, it's flashed to the frontal lobe, this part of the brain here, called the hypothalamus, is going to create a chemical that's going to match every single emotion that you have. It's going to produce a chemical signature that's going to match anger and hate and envy and jealousy and unworthiness, and you know, we can go down the line, but for every single emotion, there's a chemical signature that's manufactured in the hypothalamus, and it drops it right into the pituitary. Then the pituitary dumps it right into the bloodstream. Now, you know what's floating in your bloodstream, or our bloodstreams? Hate and anger and unworthiness, right? And when now it's floating into the bloodstream, this modified UFO is a cell. And what happens here is, on the cell surface are receptor sites. You know, there are receptor sites, and they say in science, just mechanically, that if the receptor sites fit in lock and key, you know? That's kind of a limited understanding, but that's good enough. So now you have all these receptor sites on the cell, and there's receptor sites on the cell for anger and envy. And they fit right in. And the moment that those chemicals find their way to a target area, and they fit in lock and key, anger fits in, and it fits in, and it sends an electrochemical response to the nucleus of the cell. It actually jiggles the cell and sends it chemistry, and it sends it a message. And the moment that it sends it a message, the DNA in the cell unwind. And guess what it looks for? The DNA for anger. Now, your body is a protein-producing machine. Did you know that? That's all we are, is we're protein-producing machines. Your hair is protein, your skin's protein, your muscles are protein, your bones are protein, the enzymes to digest your food are proteins, your hormones are proteins. We are a protein-producing machine. Now, the way we produce proteins is when this DNA unravels and it produces a protein right out of this little area here, right out of this river, and it makes its way, whatever protein that we need to manufacture. So muscle cells make muscle protein. Bone cells make, skin cells make geniuses. So what happens is that anger fits into the cell, it jiggles the cell, it unwinds the DNA, and it flashes a picture in there, and the body constructs proteins now that have anger in it, the code for anger in it. So, is that protein the same healthy protein that you were producing before anger? So now we have a modified protein. The amino acids that make proteins, the building blocks, have bone protein, anger, and then bone protein continuing. So now the protein becomes a cheaper grade of protein. Do you understand? So what happens when our body starts to break down? Did you ever notice? Digestion goes down, right? When you start to age, your skin becomes less elastic. Your muscles don't have the tonus. Your joints, which are made of synovial fluid that are proteins, are what? Stiff. So the quality of our protein, the expression of our protein, starts to spiral downward. Do you understand? So when it fits in lock and key, and by the way, I talked to them about DNA. I said that we use, and the last current information is that there's over 300 billion nucleotide pairs in the human genome, in the DNA, and that we use approximately 3% of that DNA. Now that DNA expression is what determines our physical appearance. If you have brown hair, if you have black skin or brown skin, if you have blue eyes, if you have brown eyes, if you're tall, if you're short, if you have big hands, big feet, whatever. It just is an expression of our physicality. That's the 3% that we're expressing. Do you understand? And when I was in Africa, I learned that the silverback gorilla, the gorillas, they have the same genetics as a human being, and they only alter by 2% of the 3% that we're expressing. Pretty interesting. We're that close. So we have all this 97% available. And I said, then that 97% are the genetics for living forever, are the genetics for wings, for warm-bloodedness, and I listed everything that you can possibly think of in the mind of God. I figured, what the heck, I might as well, right? So I listed all these things in the mind of God: to be invisible, to be in two places at once, because the 97% that exists in the DNA is the mind of God, right? And which is directly correlated to what? That there. So what we're doing in our brain is we're fabricating chemicals that fit in lock and key, that once it fits in, it looks for the part of the DNA that's going to create anger or frustration or envy. And then the cell is going to produce a protein that has that signature now being expressed in the physical body. So the example I use is, I said, imagine now a person lives their whole life in fear and weakness. They consistently produce those chemicals every day. And after 30 years of doing that, fear and weakness are unraveling the DNA in the bone cell. And so you have collagen, which is the bone protein, with a little fear in there, a little more collagen, a little weakness. And now what happens after 30 years is the bone becomes what? Brittle. What is that called? Osteoporosis. Or the Ram uses the example of people who have diabetes or genetically have had diabetes, that their greed is the emotion. So the person thinks, they've gotten ripped off in their life and they don't owe anybody anything, and they're drawn from their experiences. And so they're producing now, the greed fits in lock and key, it unravels the DNA, it photographs it, and now the insulin that's produced, which is a protein, is what? Altered. And as soon as insulin alters the slightest bit, guess what? You change the sequence of amino acids, it's no longer insulin. You understand? So, the body's a protein-producing machine, and as we alter the proteins, then we can project that we alter the health of the body. And how do we do that? Every time we have an emotion, let's just suppose that now we're producing much more anger than there are receptor sites for. Nature always compensates for that. This cell will multiply about 50 times in your lifetime, and the next time that this cell multiplies, guess what happens? It creates more receptor sites because there's more of a demand for anger, and less receptor sites for what? Nutrition, vitamins and minerals. And so what happens is the cells start producing more of these receptor sites to accommodate for the demand. And that's called this is a scientific word, regulation. The cell downregulates. It becomes altered. And if we do that 20 or 30 times, cell after cell, can you see if there's going to be any room for any nutritional consumption? So there were Hindus in the audience, and I said, so then does it matter what you eat? It was the medical doctor sitting in the Hindu guy sitting right up in front. And I said, does it matter the type of food you eat, whether you're vegetarian or not? If you live by your emotions and you're producing a change in the proteins in your body, and these receptor sites are all blocked because there's more receptor sites for those limited emotions that we're addicted to, then does it matter what you eat? And I said, when you crave emotions, or when your body is craving an emotion, can you see physiologically if we did this? If we took away, which is the greatest fast, right? We didn't allow the body to have an emotion. What's the first thing the body's going to do? It's going to go into chaos. Because you're taking away its substantial life force or the food that it's existed on. And I said that the absence of any of these chemicals is what we call joy, because then the body is free. So turn to your neighbor and explain that, and then I'll finish up. So then we can say that if we look at attitude, attitude is directly proportional to the neural net you have, right? Your attitude shapes your neural net. The attitude that shapes your neural net produces peptides in your brain. Those peptides in your brain are directly proportional to the receptor sites on your cells, which are directly proportional to the expression of DNA, which is directly proportional to the expression of life, which is directly proportional to health. So if we could see, we pick any one of these, we looked at a person's receptor sites, we saw what was on the receptor sites, we would know the type of health they had, right? If we looked at their neural net, we would know the type of peptides they were producing, and we would know what? The health they had. So then, just by deduction then, that attitude, which is directly proportional to neural net, which is directly proportional to the peptides made in the brain, which is proportional to the receptor sites, which is proportional to the expression of DNA or the expression of life, is what health is all about. So your attitude is what determines your health. All of that, just to say that. So, I finished my lecture, and of course I gave him an example of the opposite. of using, instead of how the body becomes chemically prepared if we picked an outrageous dream or a vision, how the peptides would prepare the body to walk into that experience. Every time you focus, your body becomes altered or prepared for the experience that you're manifesting, right? Your body's got to match the experience. So your body's, I used an example where instead of using an emotion that caused the downward spiral of the body, I used an example of picking a dream or a desire, and how the peptides would actually cause a different expression of DNA to produce different proteins to prepare the body to walk into the experience. So everybody understand that? So I gave him that example. But the last thing I talked about, and what I said to him, I said, so this school, what we're learning in this school, and the students are getting very good at that, is that we are learning how to dissociate, and I love that word. We're learning how to dissociate from people, places, things, times, and events. We're learning how to dissociate or shut off this part of the brain that has to do with our neural net and focus on an idea or a concept to actually be something else. And I said that, and like Jesus Christ said, there's two paths. And he said that, he clearly said when he was being the Son of Man, he was being what? His neural net. But when he developed the ability consistently to shut this part of the brain off, those slices of the brain that shape behavior, shape his humanity, he could dissociate from that and be the Son of God, is the time that he performed all his miracles. And the students in the school are developing the skill to be able to create a distinction between when we're the Son of Man or the daughter of man, and when we're being the son or the daughter of God. And by sheer practice, being in the sandbox in the school, and every discipline, practicing and creating the distinction between being one or the other, by law of association, law of repetition, is what is allowing the miraculous to happen in this school. Thank you.